Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Dear students, hope you all are doing well. Welcome back to another very exciting session of soft tissue characterization and applications. Let's get started. Today we are going to talk about an introduction to the soft tissues. So in the last class we had just described how we look upon as a soft tissue from a macro scale, right? We had very briefly touched upon what all soft tissues we'll be discussing and focusing on during this course from the head to toe. So today I'm going to talk about a brief introduction about all those soft tissues, a little bit into the anatomy, what those soft tissues really do. That will get us started in the right platform, and then we will slowly move towards the mechanical properties and other details. So let's get started. All right, so the first soft tissue here is skin. So skin, as we all know, in humans, it's one of the largest organ. So this might be new to a lot of us, that why is skin called an organ, but it is still like anatomically known as an organ. It's the largest organ on the human body. It has a surface area of approximately 1.6 to 1.8 meters square, spread all across the body, and accounts for 5.5% of the body mass. Okay, its functions include temperature regulation, sensitive interface like feeling of touch or stimulus, storage of lipids, and protecting organs against direct damage or injury from the outer environment. So whenever there is an injury or there is a interpenetration or interaction with a foreign body or the environment, all our internal organs and tissues are covered with skin. So that is the first line of defense. Skin is basically the first line of defense against any kind of outer environment or interactions. Okay, so that's why skin should have the right properties to protect us, right? It is a non-homogeneous meaning it is not uniform all across when you go from one part of the skin to another. It is viscoelastic. This is a term I'm going to talk at length in the later classes. This is a more of a technical term, but I'll just explain very briefly what this is. So visco is viscous, which has like flowable properties, and elastic is something which is going to come back to its original shape, right? Like a rubber band. Rubber band is highly elastic, so that's going to come back to where you started from, even if you pull it, right? So something which flows and is elastic, so that is known as viscoelastic. So tissues are such as skin are very similar, right? Anisotropic material. Anisotropic means if you take a patch of skin or a specimen or a sample of skin from any part of your body, if you test the skin under uniaxial loads or some kind of loads like on one direction versus you test it across the other direction, it is going to give you different mechanical properties, right? That is what anisotropy means. This is again a term which I'm going to explain later in much more detail. So typically the skin has a thickness range of 0.4 to 2.6 millimeters, and this is across different body locations, and an average thickness of 2 millimeters. So if you're trying to use some ballpark estimate of what skin tissue thickness would be for your experiments or like for your computational models, you could use 2 millimeters. That's a standard norm, right? Skin is also a multi-layered material divided into three major layers. These are very important. So if we look at the figure on the top right, we are looking at the anatomy of the skin. So we start from the epidermis, which is the topmost layer, right? Usually fairly thin, and then you have the dermis, right? Dermis is majorly the load bearing component of the skin. So it is usually much more stiff or stronger than the epidermis, and this has a much wider thickness, right? Then the last component is hypodermis, right? Hypodermis is usually the fatty layer, and it doesn't have a very clear demarcation. It kind of transitions from the dermis to the fats or the underlying muscles, like, right, like, so that's the fatty layer in between, so it can become really thin in certain locations versus the other, right? So what happens when you get bleeding? So typically all the blood vessels and like veins, arteries, all are typically located somewhere up till some portion of the dermis, not exactly through the dermis, but like, let's say 50% or 70% into the dermis. So typically if you have got a cut or wound which is bleeding, then you have cut up to the dermis, right? If it is not bleeding, then you have just scratched the surface of the epidermis or just cut the epidermis, right? So that's what it means basically. So that's why understanding the skin is very important. So skin, as we know, it may seem to be very simple to look at, but it's an extremely complex structure. It not only comes in 3 layers, but is highly anisotropic. That means the material property changes when you take the same sample and test it in different directions, as well as it differs in properties based on the thickness and the location on the body. So if I take a piece of the skin from my forehead versus my thigh, it's going to have very different property, right? So when we say this is just skin, we cannot standardize by just saying skin. We have to clearly mention where is the skin sample from, right? That is very, very important. It has much more complex attributes when you test skin from the cadavers, which is a dead body basically, from the morgue. So under the ethical guidelines, so when you're testing on that, depending on the freshness of the cadaver, whether this is within the last 12 hours of death versus like this is a old cadaver for which is preserved for the last 30 days, the skin property again significantly changes. So similar attributes you are going to observe for other soft tissues as well, right? Skin is just the tip of the iceberg. So let's go further into the skin. Let's see what's going on. So dermis, like I've said, is the major contributor to the mechanical behavior of the skin tissue. That is the major load bearing component. The strength of the human skin depends on the collagen fibers. So skin has collagenous fibers which account for approximately 75% of the dry weight of the dermal tissue. Okay, and elastin fibers, these are another set of fibers which comprise 2 to 4% of the dry skin weight. So majority of the components are collagen fibers. This is what gives the strength, toughness and everything to the skin, right? So the mechanical properties of the skin correlate with the skin thickness because of the dermal thickness variation and amount of collagen and elastin. So whenever you have a thicker piece of skin, for example, if I take a piece of skin for my palms, it's going to be thicker, and then what I do from my forehead, because I see my skull like right here, right? It could be less than a millimeter of skin. So when you go from the forehead to the palm, what happens besides the anisotropy and the location specificity, you're looking at a change in the thickness of the skin. Due to this change in the thickness of the skin, a higher thickness has more collagen and elastin, that's why it's much more tougher. So this is a rule of thumb, right? Whenever you have thick skin, it's much more tougher. Skin is naturally under tension because of its non-uniform shape and non-linear stress-strain relationship. These are some terms I'm going to explain like as we go along. Non-uniform shape is very straightforward. Skin is not uniformly shaped. It's not in the piece of a square or a rectangle. It is spread around the body and has different curvatures and different bends and curves to it, right? Skin is typically under tension. So the skin which we have right now, so whatever my age is in during my adulthood, like typically I would see my skin to be fairly well tensed, like, so if I pull my skin, it's going to come back where it is, right? But if I look at a person who is 70 years old, right, you will see wrinkling on their skin. That is because the natural tension of the skin has diminished, right? So what is this natural tension? There are some forces which are already acting all across the skin, which is holding the skin as tight, right? So when you have a very like you have an infant or a toddler, their skin is really tight. You go from there to an adulthood, the skin slowly loses its tension, and finally through aging up it really wrinkles. There is a kind of phenomena why the wrinkling happens, but overall the aspect is loss of tension, right? Then skin has three types of natural lines within it, mainly known as pre-stressed lines or the Langer lines. These lines are the most important, right? So if you look at the figure on the right, you're looking like almost like a figure of a mummy kind of, but that's not what the figure explains. This is figure of a normal human being, and it shows the different Langer lines which are running all across the body from the head to toe. Okay, these Langer lines are naturally built out of, this is a creation of you can say the outer space or the god, like, or whichever way you want to put it. These are naturally there, and these have been measured very meticulously by a lot of researchers, right, over the period of different years. Like typically in the 1800s, 1900s, you will see a lot of literature on that, right? So typically what they did was they took cadavers, they dissected cadavers to look at these fiber lines all across the body, and now they have mapped it quite well. And this approximate lines are almost similar across me versus you, right? Like it's all the same. So what is the goal, or what is the importance of having these lines? So these lines basically are the fiber lines. Along these lines, if you take any mechanical property or you stretch anything, stretch a piece of skin, it is going to behave with a much more higher strength. So it has a higher mechanical property or higher strength. If you pull a skin perpendicular or orthogonal to this direction of the fibers, it is going to behave in a much more softer or compliant way. So this imparts the anisotropy to the skin. So if I take a sample, like bend at a 30 degrees or something to my torso, or the line of my chin to the very bottom, then basically along that 30-degree, whatever the fiber directions are, that will decide what the property of the skin would be. Very, very complex phenomena, right? And then we have wrinkle lines which are different from Langer lines. Wrinkle lines are typically there are gaps and lines which are also clearly demarcated. So typically you will get the wrinkles from there when you age up, right? They do not contribute to the mechanical property that much. The next is contour lines. So contour lines is where you have interaction of two skin planes, right? For example, joint of cheek and nose. So all these different contours, wherever I have a different tissue, like for example my nose, my eyes, wherever my ears start, all this kind of lines which kind of clearly demarcates my different organs or different like undulations on my body, these are all known as these contour lines. This provide the aspect, otherwise my nose can be extending from here to here, so these lines are a must. These are again creation which are natural, right? And they are sometime like changed with plastic surgery and things like that, but these are natural contour lines. These again contour lines do not affect the mechanical properties of the soft tissue, right? Then the human skin mechanical properties, it's worthy to mention, it's highly anisotropic and widely dependent on the orientation of the Langer lines, like I've just mentioned. So on the figure here on the bottom right, what you see is a bunch of specimens which can be cut, or samples which can be cut in order to do some mechanical tests. These are typically known as dog bone samples or dog bone specimens because it looks like a dog bone. So if you look from 1 through 10, you are looking at a bunch of specimens which are cut on the back of a human body, right? So the differences in them are they are from different locations on the back, as well as they are oriented differently. So one was vertically towards the head, one is like vertical orthogonal to that head or perpendicular to that head, one is at a certain angle, and along with that you have an overlay of the different Langer lines on the bottom. So if you look at all of this together, you can very clearly estimate that the properties of all these samples, the mechanical properties, are going to be widely different, again being from the same location, because skin is highly anisotropic. So that's the representation which this figure is trying to show. Okay, so skin, like I said, is just the tip of the iceberg for the soft tissue mechanics introduction, and this itself is a very complex tissue. So think about organs and other aspects, right? So let's get to the next ones. The next soft tissue which is highly important is the muscles. The muscle exhibits contractile and flexible properties, which are what is this non-linear property? Non-linear basically means, this is again I'm going to explain it later on, when you apply a certain force or you apply a certain displacement which gives rise to force, they are not going to have like a linear relationship. Linear relationship means, it doesn't mean like I increase this by 4, the other quantity is also going to increase by 4. They will have a highly non-linear relationship which cannot be predicted by a single line which I would like to fit there, right? So they have to be modeled or simulated using much more complex polynomial based equations, or they're known as hyperelastic equations, which I'm going to talk about at a different point in this course, right? So coming back here, we are looking at nonlinear, viscoelastic, I've already explained briefly, and anisotropic. So these properties you will see will keep on repeating like for majority of the soft tissues. So majority of the soft tissues are actually nonlinear, viscoelastic, and anisotropic. Muscles specifically control different functions of the human body. This I had talked about in the first class, where we said that the skeleton of the human body is not responsible for all your movements, even though sometimes we have the wrong depiction that the skeleton is moving during gait analysis and other aspects, right? But typically what is going on is your muscles are imparting that strength through, of course, like there is neural transmission that these muscles have to get activated and raise my hand. So it's not like my skeleton is raising the hand, my muscles are doing the right action and activation in order to raise my hands, right? So the basic contractile unit of a muscle tissue is the sarcomere. That is the unit cell or the basic unit of a muscle, and it has a varying length of 1.5 microns. Microns is 10 raised to power negative 6, right? Micrometers, which is 1,000th of a millimeter, right? So 1.5 microns during full shortening and 2.5 microns at rest. So all these sarcomeres, which are basically the unit cell components of these muscle tissues, they kind of extend from 2.5 microns at rest to the full shortening, and that kind of change in the length causes all the muscles to move in proper coordination, right? And up to 4 microns at full lengthening. So some places they have to elongate, some places they have to contract in order to do several operations. So when I am trying to do my this kind of a hand action, I'm actually trying to elongate certain muscles in my hand, but when I'm trying to do this kind of an action, I'm probably just contracting certain muscle segments, right? So that differs, but that's the theory of the things. So the sarcomere is kind of the unit cell unit, and then you have muscle tissues which are classified into 3 categories. This is just to give you an overview of all the soft tissues we'll be talking about and testing them, because unless we understand the anatomy and how complex they are, we will never be able to do the right mechanical characterization of them. We need to understand what their personalities are, right? So muscle tissues, first category is skeletal muscle, right? So the movement of the human body is dependent on the skeletal muscles. So these are the muscles which are basically transferring the loads to the skeleton, and that is causing all my gait and different movements, right? 40 to 50% of the human body mass is taken by the skeletal muscles, right? They're responsible for the skeletal movement of handling loads during the body motion and are attached to the bones. Good to know. The next part is smooth muscles. Smooth muscles typically surround and are a part of the respiratory system, right? Respiratory system is your upper tract, which is basically the trachea, versus like, and it goes all the way down to the lungs, right? You're looking at the this part, and then you have the lungs and the different components of the lungs. Then they also line or cover the different components of the urogenital tract, blood vessels. So they are pretty important. Smooth muscles are basically forming all the blood vessels, and organs such as the stomach and the intestines, right? So all the bigger organs like the stomach and the small and the large intestines, they are all kind of lined and surrounded by the smooth muscles. So why not skeletal muscle there? Because you don't have the involvement of the skeleton first, and second is they have a different objective of, like, stimulating or activating certain aspects of that organ to cause a certain function. So there is a area of research which is known as a structure function relationship of an organ. So that means how does an organ or a soft tissue is structurally, and what are the different activations going on, and how that is contributing to the overall working or the functioning of the organ. Example is the human heart, right? But we are coming to the human heart for the next type of muscle, which is known as the cardiac muscle. This tissue pushes the blood throughout the body and is only present in the human heart. So this is native to the human heart. This again is extremely complex, and I have seen it personally, where human heart has different layers of fibers going in multiple layers, and there are clear demarcations between fibers from here to there versus to the left ventricle, right ventricle, and it's all wrapped around together. So very difficult to dissect and kind of look at the fibers, what is going on, right? So having said that, if you want to dig deeper into the different muscle anatomies, you can look at the figure on the bottom right, where you're basically looking at the front and back side of the human body, and you are looking at some of the important muscles which are present here, starting from the pectorals, just above the chest, the biceps, quite commonly known. Then you have trapezius, which are connecting the neck to the shoulder. Deltoids you have basically on the shoulder. Then you have latissimus dorsi, rectus. These are all terminologies which are typically you would see there from the European or Spanish origin. So the reason for that is uh, the Spanish or the Europeans like spent a lot of time during the 1800s, 1700s, and even 1900s figuring out the human body. They were really interested in understanding the human body, right? And they did all sorts of dissection and anatomical surgeries or techniques, like to understand what every aspect of the human body looks like, and they have been instrumental in creating a lot of this wealth of knowledge into the anatomy, right? So these folks, that's why, due to their language, have named these different muscles and different anatomical components like this, like rectus or obliques, erector spinae. Like a lot of them, these may not sound like English terms, right? So I'm not going to get into the depth of all these anatomical muscle names, but just to give you a brief idea of the major ones, right? Then you have erector spinae, and then you have adductors, soleus muscles, rhomboids, triceps. These are commonly known. If you do any sort of gymming, you will know you're talking about biceps and triceps, right? Gluteals, which are the hip muscles. So these are the different length and breadth of the different muscles from the head to toe. So we started with skin from head to toe. Now we are going one step inside the human body, which is into the muscles, and we will slowly start digging in, right? So let's go further. So the next interesting soft tissue, and a very important soft tissue, is known as the tendon. Tendons are known as connective tissues. They're from the families of the connective tissues. Tendons provide the coordinating connection between a muscle and a bone by transmitting the forces produced by muscle contractions to maintain or create motion through joints. So all our motions are caused by tendons, which are helpful in transferring the loads from the muscles to the bones. Bones meaning the outer skeletal structure, right? So tendons are, that's why, very, very important. The tendons are therefore connecting the muscles and the bones all across the body. There are n number of tendons all across the human body, and if you look at the literature of anatomy, you will again see various names, right? And the figures on the right are basically showing that. But I would like to direct you towards the figure on the top right, where basically it clearly highlights that a bone and a muscle, how a tendon is having the bridge, basically, right? So the tendon fibers are arranged parallelly in the direction of the load applied and thereby show uniaxial stress strain relationship. So tendons are much less anisotropic and more towards the isotropic component. They have typically, they are anisotropic, of course they have fibers, but their fibers are typically, so whenever I have a tendon which is responsible for certain movement of my arm or certain aspects in the human body, the tendons are naturally created in a way that their fibers are all properly aligned towards the direction of loading. So I cannot move my hand like this, I cannot twist my arm like this, right? I can only raise it like this. So there are tendons which connect, and they have a parallel orientation of the fibers. Why does it have parallel? Because parallel provides the maximum strength. Whenever the fibers are oriented towards the direction of the load, fibers are typically the harder or the stronger part, right? That will allow a larger strength which is there with that particular part, and tendons are typically of much higher strength than any other soft tissue, right? Then the next part is the tendons transmit muscular forces over long lengths sometimes and shows a high tensile strength and stiffness, right? So this is very common aspect of tendons. What are the tendons on the human body? If you look from the head to toe, there are a lot of these tendons. Like on the throat, you're looking at anterior triangle tendon, posterior triangle, tendon of origin, deltoid, infraclavicular fossa, then tendon of insertion. Like there are so many. ACEs. ACEs is something which we use quite often with the gait analysis. These are particular, you know, edges of the hip bone where you can clearly see like a bone bulging. So they are the aces which connect the hip bone to the rest of your body. Then your sternum, clavicle, these are very commonly known tendons, right? And if you look from the back side, you have a range of tendons again, like the span of scapula, you have iliac crest, you have sacral triangle at the bottom. Like there are so many. All these have a specific naming and naming convention or nomenclature per se. Like for example, whenever you say iliac, it has something to mean with the deal with the hip or something like that, right? So every term has a meaning associated with where they are located, as well as they have some Spanish or European influence. Typically there is some English influence as well, but majority of the terms would be like non-English, right? Okay, so going further, not digging into the different sorts of tendons, the next one is ligament. This is again a very important soft tissue, very similar to tendons. Ligaments are connective tissues again from that family, and they support the musculoskeletal system and transmit the loads across the skeletal joints, right, to perform various physiological functions. So what is physiology? Physiology is the normal, as a canvas term, it's the normal working of the body when all your aspects of the different body are working fine, starting from the cells to the neurons to the muscles to the bones, right? Everything is working in the right coordination. That's a right human physiology. So physiology is a study of how each of the body organs or systems function. So that's the study of physiology, but we're not going to get into that. So what we are talking about here is tendons. Similar to tendons, we have the ligaments. Tendons, we have seen, it connects a bone to a muscle. Ligaments on the other hand connects bones to bones. One of the very common ligaments is the ACL, right, which is on your and a human knee ligament, where you are basically the femur connected with the tibia. Femur is the longest bone on your body. That's basically your hip bone, like below the hip bone, that's the long stretch of your leg. Tibia is when from the knee downwards, that's the bone, and these tibia and the femur are directly connected with the Lateral collateral ligament. Collateral is a term where collateral damage is something which we hear quite often. So whenever there is some kind of a good thing to be done, there could be collateral damage where somebody else gets harmed without the real intention. So that's why very similar to the terminology there, this is known as lateral collateral ligament. So that will be a sacrificial ligament if there is a certain, all of a sudden there is an impact. Typically a lot of cricketers and footballers, you will see them having this knee injury, right? And they will need a surgery to basically replace the ligament, or have a brace or a graft which is placed to attach that ligament together, right? Without that, you don't have a bone to bone transfer of forces, and that can cause really huge difficulty with your gait, right, or normal walking or running or your daily activities. There is another ligament which holds the knee together, which is medial collateral ligament, and then you have medial meniscus and lateral meniscus. Meniscus is a much more softer soft tissue which is in between, kind of having like a coating or a jelly kind of in between, right? So ligaments are composed of dense connective fibrous tissues and have mechanical viscoelastic properties. Okay, for limiting the relative movements, ligaments connect one bone to another. So this is one of the primary objective of the ligaments. So can I rotate my arm? I can rotate my arm this side, but can I rotate my arm on the other side? This part on the other side, I cannot, right? So that is, this rotation or movement is prevented by a ligament. Similar to your feet, like there are so many locations on your body where you can just move to a certain aspect and not beyond that. We are not 100% flexible, right? So these kind of constraints or prevention of further movement of your body at certain locations is caused by the ligaments, right? Tendons and ligaments can be stretched typically between 5 to 7% without damage. Whenever they are stretched over on top of this, like let's say 8% or 9%, that's the gray area, this can cause catastrophic damage. You can definitely like have like a really bad crack on your ligament, and then you are basically on the bed rest and you need a surgery in certain aspects, right? So 5 to 7% is a good ballpark to know, approximate to know, basically when you are trying to run any experiments or understand from a product standpoint how much the ligaments can possibly stretch at a certain location, right? So that's the thumb rule. The human body has more than 900 ligaments, okay, that helps connect bones, joints and organs and holds them in place. So ligaments are not only connecting bones, they are connecting a lot of different joints and also joints and organs, right? A lot of these organs, they are not just floating inside my body, right? So the lung is hinged at a certain point, the heart is like held in a certain place. So all these organs are held in a certain place through ligaments. Otherwise all my due to the gravity, all my organs will fall down, right? So they are not floating in the air, they are all kind of hinged with certain bones, typically bones, because from muscles and other places they may hang and really fall down. So bone to organ connections are also done through ligaments. Having said that, if you look at the anatomy picture on the right, if you break down the human body into half, anterior and the posterior, anterior is basically the front half and the posterior is the back half, you can see n number of ligaments out of these 900 which I just spoke of, right? So you have ligaments across your spinal cord, stretching from your neck to the sacrum, as well as you have ligaments for every joints, every organs, right? So I'm not going to dig into all these details because that's from the lessons of anatomy, that's not what we are focusing on. We just want to take an overview and understand what soft tissue is what, right? Let's go further. The next soft tissue, now we have gone in and seen the major soft tissues like skin, muscles and ligaments and tendons, which are running across the entire human body from the head to toe. Now let us focus our attention into a very important soft tissue, which is the brain, right? Brain is uniquely placed inside the skull. This is a soft tissue which is a soft wrinkled organ specifically situated inside the cranial cavity and is covered by bones of the skull. it is non-linear and viscoelastic in behavior, extremely soft, right, in nature. So if you were to look at the cross section of the brain, like, so if I can go from different aspects of the from the brain to all the way up from to my skull, you are looking at the scalp is where the hair is, then you're looking at the skull, then you have peristeal dura matter, meningeal dura matter, arachnoid matter, and then subarachnoid space. There is a little bit of space. You have pia matter, and then comes the cerebral cortex, right? So that is where the brain is encapsulated in. The brain weighs approximately 3 pounds and is human body's central nervous system, so very, very important. Approximately 100 billion neurons are housed within the brain. So these are a lot of zeros, right? Like 100 billion we are talking about. So consisting of the intracranial cerebrum and the cerebellum along with the spinal cord to transmit the information. So all the information within the brain is transmitted to the entire body through the spinal cord, and this is the main storage or the powerhouse of your system, right? The brain is filled and immersed in a fluid which is known as cerebrospinal fluid by layers of membranes and meninges, right? Why this knowledge is very important, because if I am doing some kind of impact sport analysis, or I'm trying to understand development of a helmet or an armor for the head, I want to make sure that this is not affecting the brain, or the brain is not going through a concussion, or while this is within the cerebrospinal fluid, majority of the shock is absorbed properly through the head and it's not transmitted widely to the brain. That's the purpose of understanding the brain from a mechanical standpoint. So the brain can be stratified anatomically into the cerebral cortex. This is stratified means basically cutting along the cross section, what I've just shown in the figure on the middle top. Reflecting white matter overlaying the outermost gray matter. Gray matter comprises data processing neurons, and white matter consists of myelinated nerve fiber bundles that facilitate rapid transduction of signals, right? So a lot of these different soft tissues are not just tissues by mechanics or mechanical properties by itself, they have a lot of different functions which they have to cater to. So if any of these tissues get damaged at any point, then this can cause huge catastrophic impacts on our human body function, right? So the brain can be typically looked upon. If we look from the top, we are looking at the frontal lobe, we are looking at the temporal lobe, pons, cerebellum, occipital lobe from in the back. We have vertebral artery, bacillary artery, you have anterior carotid artery, your middle carotid artery. There are a lot of different arteries, and this is known as a cerebral artery network. So it's not only a blob of material which is there. Inside that you have a very complex range of vessels which are there in the forms of arteries. These are known as cerebral arteries. I'll show you in one of the classes, like how the cerebral artery network looks like when we take a nice image or a set of images and we try to do a computational model on that, right? So I'm going to showcase that. On the very right, what you're looking at is brain from the side view, and many of these things may have been already taught in a biology class back in the day, but this is just a quick refresher into the having a frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, spinal cord, cerebellum, occipital lobe. What are their locations specifically? And of course they have different functions in their own right. Do they have different material properties in terms of the brain tissue? No, they do not. Brain is typically segmented into the gray and the white matter, right? They have different properties. Uh, but if you had to slice the brain, which this particular person is doing, they're just cutting slices like you cut slices of a bread. You will be typically looking at the browny part, which is the brown part, which is the gray matter, and then you have the white matter, and then you have the different ventricles or different arteries which are moving around, right? So those things are there. Ventricles are typically hollow regions, and then you have vessels which are moving around. So that's typically, if you cut a slice of the brain, that's how the mechanical properties or the properties of the brain look like. Let's go further. The next soft tissue is known as nasal cavity. nasal cavity has everything to do with our nose. It is the body's initial airway route and serves as the respiratory system's primary external opening, right? The anterior nasal cavity portion is supported and protected by the nose made of bone, cartilage, muscle, and skin, right? Anterior is always in the front. Whenever we are talking this course, anterior is in the front and posterior is on the back, right? So anterior is the front of the nose. Its primary function is to moisturize, warm, and filter the air before reaching the lungs. So that's the main aspect of the nose, right? The most anterior portion of the nasal cavity is called the vestibule, right? The exterior nares or nostrils lead into this portion of the nasal cavity, which is essentially just a short passageway lined with hair that leads into the respiratory region of the nasal cavity. So we have this nasal hairs, they're there for a reason, right? So they filter the air and take care of the dust and your mucus and other places, which kind of filters out the dust and other things from before the air reaches the lungs, right? The reason we're talking about all these organs specifically is because we need to understand their how these organs look like from a soft tissue standpoint in order to dive into the course of soft tissue mechanics, where we want to really understand what the properties are. If we just give a property of the nose, that may not suffice because it has a lot of tissues, similar to the brain. If I say just brain has this tissue property of this and this, right, that is not correct, which we just found out. So that is the purpose of explaining and going over the brief of all the organs, just touching upon them to understand what they are. The respiratory region makes up for the largest portion of the nasal cavity. The specialized tissue in this area functions to aid in the respiratory process, right? The apex, or the outermost pyramidal area of the nasal cavity, contains all the receptors and cells necessary for olfaction. Olfaction is the sense of smell, right? So nose is not only for breathing, it gives us the sense of smell. The nasal cavity has a lining of hairs and mucus to restrict dust particles, pollens, etc. in the human body. So those hairs and mucus is just not for the sake of it. So if we get our nose entirely clean, that's not a very good idea, right? Like then we are basically not having any filter at all, like into the air which is going in. So from a soft tissue or an anatomy standpoint, we are looking at the nasal cavity on the right side top, where we can look at the frontal sinus. So sinus is somewhere here. So typically people who have sinus problems and others like that, bone is deformed, or there is some mucus which has gone into the sinus, there is a sinus pain and sinusitis, and there are a lot of disease modalities like that. Then you have superior nasal concha, and then you have the middle nasal concha. These are all different soft tissues which are in the nasal cavity. Then you have the nasal cavity itself, like which you call as the nasal cavity. The inferior nasal concha vestibule is the initial part from where you breathe in. Then you have a hard palate, which kind of transitions towards your gum, or where your mouth cavity is. Then you have the oral cavity. So just below the nasal cavity, you have the oral cavity, separated by the hard palate, right? You have the olfactory bulb at somewhere here. That's where the olfaction or the sense of smell starts. Typically within the nasal cavity, the green region is the olfaction region. That's where these there are sensors or receptors which take and send the right signals, which is recognized by your body by whether I am smelling an orange or I'm smelling a lavender or whatever that smell is, right? Then you have another sinus gland which is known as the sphenoid sinus. Then you have nasopharnax, which is kind of leading a little bit towards the pharnax, which is the airway going up to the lungs. Then you have eustachian tube opening, respiratory region, and soft palate. So typically, if you have majority of the infections, they happen in the upper respiratory system. So this is along the mouth and the nasal cavity, right? So there are three other important per se like aspects, which is known as bulbo olfactorio in the top of the nose, membrana eritomatosa and then you have cornetes like on the back side. So these are the different soft tissues which are of primary importance besides the other tissues which I have just explained, right? So this is the chat about the nasal cavity. I have marked them as F01 and F02 like this because these are primarily organs. Earlier I was talking about not the organs, but they are the different wide range of soft tissues like skin, muscles, ligaments and tendons, but now we have moved towards the organs. The first organ was the brain, second is the nasal cavity. The third one is known as the oral cavity. So there is a secondary exterior opening to the respiratory tract. So respiration doesn't only happen from the nose, it can happen through the mouth, other than the nasal cavity, which is known as the oral cavity or the mouth, right? The oral cavity is lined by a mucous membrane, which is known as the oral mucosa, consisting of a stratified means which is layers, squamous epithelium, okay, and an underlying connective tissue layer which is known as lamina propria, right? So the surface is kept moist with mucus produced by the major and numerous minor salivary glands. The oral mucosa is well supplied with nerve endings, right? And on the dorsal surface of the tongue, special sensory endings for the taste are provided. The submucosa underlying the lamina propria of the oral cavity is variable. So these are a lot of terms in which, like, certain soft tissues become functionally helpful, right? At times the lamina propria or the submucosa are substantially so similar that they merge imperceptibly, like without having you to distinguish between them, right? So if you look at the figures on the right, you're looking at the oral cavity, you're looking at the heart palate, where we just explained in terms of the nasal cavity. There is this heart palate which separates the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. Then you have the soft palate on the back side, right? Then you have the oropharynx. You have the nasopharynx, and then you have the oropharynx. Pharynx typically talks about something which is kind of an ending tube or pipe to it, right? Inner surfaces of the lips are also part of your oral cavity. All of these have different soft tissue properties. So if you have a wounding or cut to your lips, what's the soft tissue property of your lips? This is not the property of the skin. They have a different property. What is the property of your gum? It's a different property, right? Then you have the tongue, which has a component known as the terminal sulcus, and this is basically the anterior pillars and the palatoglossal arches, which are also different soft tissues, right? There are different types of intraoral tissues. Intra means inside, like within the oral cavity. What are the different kinds of tissues? You are looking at the teeth, you are looking at jaws, which are typically known as maxilla or the mandible, and you are looking at the hard palate. All of these are separate soft tissues, right? Then the next part is you have intraoral soft tissues like the gingiva. You have the or sometimes you call them as gingiva, or whichever. The pronunciation may differ a little bit based on the kind of English accent which you have. So the gingiva, tongue, lips, buccal mucosa, labial mucosa, soft palate, floor of the mouth, and the pharynx. These are all different sorts of soft tissues which are part of the oral tissues, right? And they all differ in properties. So if you look at the anatomical figure here on the bottom right, you can see where the gingiva is. Your gingiva is basically the gums, right? And then you have the lips, then you have hard palate, which is the kind of the top of my mouth, right? Then the soft palate, which kind of transitions from the top of my mouth towards the inside. You have the uvula, which is that small kind of bell kind of a thing, like dip. Then you have the palatine tonsils. Tonsils have very unique properties, and they will be discussed here as a part of the organs as well. Then you have the papillae of tongue, and then you have certain teeth, which are of course not soft tissues. Most of these teeth could be considered as hard tissues, and these you have the tongue. Basically, tongue has a very unique property of having different soft tissue formations, right? Okay, the fourth organ is the tongue itself, right? We were talking about the oral cavity, and tongue itself is a very interesting organ in itself, right? The tongue is the major functional organ of the upper airway that helps to swallow, speak, lick, breathe, and consists of a bumpy, thin skin-like layer of many muscles. The extremely muscular, has a lot of different layers of muscles, and facilitates in so many different aspects like swallowing, speaking, licking, breathing, and several other aspects like tasting, of course, right? The tongue is just posterior and medial to the teeth and acts to grasp the food. This posterior and medial terms, posterior is on the back side and medial is somewhere on the side. These are anatomical terms I'm going to skip for now, right? And acts to grasp the food, forcing it to swallow as it pushes by the tongue's, gets pushed by the tongue's muscle, right? So the tongue lets you swallow. The tongue is a muscular organ in the mouth. This is covered with a moist pink tissue known as the mucosa. Tiny bumps known as papillae give the tongue its rough texture. So all this kind of tiny bumps are the different papillae on the tongue, right? So these will give the rough texture, and of course a different material property, an isotropic property. The tongue is anchored to the mouth by webs of tough tissue and mucosa. The tether holding down the front of the tongue is known as the frenum, right? So that is the holding for the tongue, otherwise it's going to fall off, right? In the back of the mouth, the tongue is anchored with the hyoid bone. This is a very important bone. So it's in the back of the tongue. It's kind of, it's not going all the way into our like pharynx, like it's kind of pivoted or held at the hyoid bone, which is an important bone. Thousands of taste buds sense food taste on the tongue's surface, and the information is further transmitted to the brain. This is what the functioning of the tongue is, right? So looking at the anatomy of the tongue in the very picture on the top, we are looking at the lateral glossoepiglottic fold. Very complex terms sometimes to pronounce, right? But they have certain meanings why they have been named like that. Epiglottic is like, epi has a certain meaning, epi is outside, and glottic is related to the glottis. Then glosso is something else, like, so these are all anatomical terms which I'm not going to get into the detail. Epiglottis is there here again here. Then you have palatine tonsils, you have lingual tonsils, all having different functions for your human body, but they are, at the end of the day, they are all soft tissues, right? So we have to consider all of them while discussing the disease or injury to any of the soft tissues. So if we have a tonsil injury, we cannot be using the material properties of the tongue. It has its unique material properties of its own, right? So that is the purpose of like looking through so many different soft tissue demarcations which within a single organ, which we can see here very clearly, right? Then there is apex of the tongue, the body of the tongue, which is the valate papillae, the foliate papillae, the median sulcus of the tongue. The frenum is very important, that's the bottom. Then you have the hyoid bone from which the tongue is kind of associated with. These are the papillae. And here on the figure on the bottom left, you are looking at the different aspects like sour taste, bitter taste. So typically if you are eating something sour, that sour taste will come on the sides of the tongue, bitter taste will come on the back of the tongue, salty typically on the sides a little bit towards the front, and very bottom is the sweet tasting region. This is where the sensors can quickly grasp. So this is a scheme of things for the tongue, like in terms of soft tissue, I think. So with this time hai ya ho gaya 53 मिनट से हो गया ना, ठीक है. तो इसको एडिट कर देंगे आई थिंक. तो और एक दो मिनट फिर ठीक है. तो मुझे लगा आप शायद इशारा कर रहे हो, समझा. ठीक है. सो आई विल कंटिन्यू. So with this, let's get to the next organ, which is tonsils, right? Tonsils are a very vital part of our immune system that restricts germs such as bacteria and viruses and kills them with antibodies formed by the immune cells while breathing to avoid infection in the throat and lungs, right? So tonsils are our primary saviors, like while we are trying to save ourselves from a viral infection or a bacterial infection or some form of threat infection which can happen, right? So they prevent our throat and lungs by creating all these antibodies and killing them with them, the antibodies, right? So the back of the mouth comprises of two tonsils. It's very clear. We have always known where our tonsils are. These are typically known as fleshy lumps. These are made up of flesh, but they have a unique material property, one on each side. The size of the tonsils may vary from one person to another. So some people, based on the structure of your body, may have bigger tonsils, and based on the different conditions may have different tonsil sizes, right? And the exposure to an infection, sometimes tonsils can get extremely inflamed or bulge up during an infection. They're kind of a sacrificial system, like let's say they are kind of your protector, which will itself get injured and try to cause minimum damage, which is caused by the virus or bacteria, to your throat or the lungs. So that's why they would have an inflammation kind of response, right? The palatine or the fascial tonsils, commonly referred to as tonsils, are bundles of lymphatic tissue located in the lateral oropharynx, right? They sit in the isthmus. Isthmus is again a term which is used from the European literature. Isthmus is like the end of something, isthmus of a country, of the fascias, and bordered anteriorly by the palatoglossal arch and posteriorly by the palatopharyngeal arch. So a lot of these terms are very difficult to pronounce, like, but they have been built based on certain anatomical indications, right? So from a figure standpoint, you're looking at the locations of the tonsil. Pharyngeal tonsils are the more on the top side, like somewhere here, like near to the nasal cavity. Then you have the tubal tonsils and the palatine tonsils. Palatine tonsils are typically the tonsils which we know. So there are more tonsils than we know, right? Then you have lingual tonsils. So lingual tonsils are here, that gives you the linguistics or your voice, right, or how you speak. So everyone speaks in a very different way, and everyone has a very different flow of speaking that is kind of guided with the lingual tonsils, besides the other aspects like teeth and tongue, right? Okay, the next one, soft tissue, is known as salivary glands. So salivary glands cover the connective tissue capsules and perform the primary purpose of producing saliva, right? Serous and mucous secretions and mixtures containing mainly water, proteins, glycoproteins and electrolytes. So salivary glands typically creates the saliva in your mouth, and that helps you break down the food which we eat and lets it go further towards your stomach for better digestion. It is secreted into the oral cavity and is rich in enzymes that enable the food to break down and lubricate the swallowed food to make it easier to swallow. If the food is not lubricated properly, it is extremely dry. Dry is where we cannot eat very dry stuff, right? Like, so that's the thing. Like, so typically the saliva lubricates the food in such a way that it can pass through the different regions of the body, right? So salivary glands are located outside the oral mucosa and deliver saliva in the mouth through the ducts. So from an anatomical standpoint, this is how the glands are positioned like. So you have parotid salivary glands here and the parotid duct, which basically has this opening and sends the saliva into the oral cavity, and you have sublingual ducts on the bottom. Sublingual salivary glands are there. So a lot of these different salivas come in, like it's not a single gland which is producing the saliva. The human body is extremely complex but extremely interesting. That's one of the aspects which I've seen. Like every aspect of the soft tissue has such a nice story and anatomy to itself, and how it functions and how it behaves mechanically. And that's the beauty of this course. We are going to touch upon all these aspects, right? Submandibular duct, submandibular salivary glands, these are different segments of the salivary glands. So we are going to basically continue on taking the overview of the different tissues which we are looking at. I think around or some more tissues which very briefly cover before we move towards properties of these tissues further. So just stay tuned, and I'll see you guys again very shortly. Thank you.